Welcome to the ITSP Magazine Podcast Network. You're listening to a new episode of the Leadership Student Podcast with MK Palmore. We are all lifelong learners, and nowhere is this more relevant than in the practice of leadership. Our goal is continual learning and improvement. Let's get after it. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
Hey folks, this is MK Palmore. Welcome back to the Leadership Student Podcast. Today in a virtual studio, I have Grayson James, who is a former CEO and current author of a book called Full Contact Performance, The International Art of Organizational Collaboration. Grayson is again, former CEO, certainly someone who's practiced in the discipline of leadership. So we want to, as we do here on the Leadership Student Podcast, dive right into the subject of leadership, hear a little bit about Grayson's story, but really get into the nuts and bolts of how he operates in the leadership realm and discipline and the art of leadership, and hear a little bit about his story. So Grayson, welcome to the virtual studio. Glad to have you here.
Thanks, MK. Good to be with you.
Awesome. So let me give the title of that book again, because I screwed it up. Full Contact Performance, The Internal Art of Organizational Collaboration. Interesting title. Let's dive right in. How'd you pick the title and the subject matter?
Well, the title, give you a little bit of background. For the past 40 years or so, I've been studying and for most of that time also teaching the martial art of Aikido. And in Aikido is not considered a full contact martial art in the classical sense. Full contact is a term in martial arts that refers to a type of sparring or a competition or training where you really go at it. You don't pull your punches. Your strikes are true and strong, and you usually have protective gear on. But even if you're wearing protective gear, when you're training with full contact, you can get hurt. But you also learn a lot. That's where you really learn a lot about yourself and your preparedness, the assumptions you're making about yourself, the assumptions you may be making about your opponent, your circumstantial awareness, your weak spots, your strengths. So it's a really fertile place for learning a lot. And when I think of good leadership and collaboration, similar images come to mind. People are straight with each other. They don't pull back. I'm not saying they go after each other and attack each other, but they find a way to learn how to be honest with each other and respectful at the same time and stay engaged. So that is the full contact part of the story. The internal art part of the story, the internal art of organizational collaboration, really recognizes that when we're working with other people in whatever context it is, whether you're my leader, I'm your leader, whatever it might be, or we're colleagues working on a project together, or we are thrust together because we have to get something important done in the organization. The real power, the real game lies in how am I bringing myself to this encounter? And that's a little bit counterintuitive because we often, especially with collaboration, we often assume that, well, it's all about other people. If you're collaborating, you have to focus on those other people out there. And you do, but not exclusively. And in fact, the real leverage for making change and for transforming your collaborative performance and your leadership performance is what you're doing with yourself. What are you cultivating in yourself? What are your practices? What are the assumptions you're operating on right now? What's the context that you are part of and that you're helping to either reinforce or try to change? So that is the nod to the internal art. And I really consider leadership to be an internal art.
So Grayson, you're already singing my tune, as it will. So from the title to the theory that you just espoused, these are all things that historically I have believed are part of the discipline of leadership. I always liken my reference to this as I call leadership a contact sport. In other words, you have to understand that there is there's some level of grit that's involved in this when you're having honest conversations with people, a willingness to be open, vulnerable. It's really challenging, I think, to approach it in that regard. So to hear you talk about it the way that you just did really resonates with me, and I think will resonate with others. You're touching on something that's important, a theme that I've brought up a couple of times in past conversations, and that is the idea of sort of knowing yourself and that this self-reflective nature that you have to bring into your encounters with others. Pull the thread back on that for me a little bit, how you view it, how folks get to the point where they have that level of self-realization and kind of know who they are when they show up in these engagements.
Yeah. Well, let me start by telling a little story about how I really started to orient myself in this direction. I've led a lot of workshops with different companies and different cultures and countries around the world. And one of the things that I've often do when I first start working with a group of leaders in these workshops, or just even if I'm not in workshops, if I'm just coaching a group, I ask them what works. What works, for instance, in organizational collaboration and leadership collaboration. And what got my attention first was that wherever I went, in whatever culture I was working in, most of the answers are really the same. And they're all good answers. Well, you need to be present, you need to be respectful, you need to listen well, you need to speak clearly, you need to have empathy. All of the things that pretty much everyone would agree are important for good leadership collaboration. And then from there, and I write those down. From there, we go to examining very, very closely a particular conversation that did not go well for each of the participants, or an imagined conversation that they might have with somebody that they're having trouble with in the relationship. So either one, it works. And I really guide them to look closely at that and to talk about what is their conversational strategy, what's the goal, what's the conversational strategy, how would they approach it, what would they say, and then what would happen. And what shows up there when these are accomplished, seasoned leaders, when they really look closely at their most challenging conversations, what they realize is that even though they just got done listing all of the things that work, they discovered that they're not actually doing all those things that work. They thought they were before they stepped back and we really looked closely at what was going on. And then they realized, oh my God, I've always thought that I was really good at this, like a great listener, or really encouraged dissenting views and respected differences. And now I realize that from the conversational strategy I design to the way I actually open the conversation and engage with it is very often very different than I thought it was. So people think they're doing one thing when they're actually doing another, or they're not at all aware of what they actually are doing. So it made me realize that awareness is really key. And if you don't have awareness about what you're doing and how you're doing it, including the internal aspects of what you're doing, how am I making sense of this relationship, of this conversation? What are my background stories about this person? And how is that playing out? What's going on in my body? How is my nervous system showing up right now? All of these are really central factors to how I'm going to be performing. But they're usually invisible to me because they're all habitual. So like with any habit, if we want to change it, we first have to become aware of what we're doing. And then we need to try new things.
What are some strategies that aspiring leaders and folks can use to level up that awareness and really understand what it looks like on the other side of these conversations when they step into them? What are some strategies folks can do to improve their own understanding of how they present themselves to folks?
Well, it's let me start by saying it's pretty hard usually to do it all by yourself. Just like it's hard for us to teach ourselves piano without anybody else there, or anything else that involves a real level of skill. But with your colleagues or with a good coach or instructor, you can actually do that a lot more easily. What people can do is start to ask for feedback. Tell your colleagues what are you interested in, and why would you want their feedback. Give them a little context and say, hey, look at MK, I'm working on myself as a leader here, or I want to become a better collaborative leader. And I know that I'm probably doing things that I'm not aware of that are probably evident to everybody else on the team except me. And I'm wondering if you would be willing to share what you observe. What do you see me doing that you think works? What do you think I'm doing that may not be working so well? I think that's one step. Another is to really learn about what we're doing with our nervous system, because the shape of our nervous system has a lot to do with what we can tolerate and therefore where we're able to go in our conversations. So by that, I mean, what I see whenever conversations get really tough, people's nervous system will determine what happens next. So if my nervous system is tightly wound and I feel anxious or stressed in this conversation, I'm probably not going to be as receptive to your input or to you challenging my thinking. It's going to be harder for me to tolerate than if I'm in a more chilled out, comfortable space. And again, this is something we don't usually think about. Our nervous systems just do what they do. And if we're having a good day, we're good. If we're not, then, all bets are off. So kind of getting curious about yourself is, I think, it sounds very general. I'd like to be more specific, but
No, I love it. So what you're talking about is this autonomic, I think, is the term for the response that we have biologically to uncomfortable situations, right? And that can be stress-filled situations. And for those of us, folks like myself who military and law enforcement background, I've been in situations where I've seen what it means for me to be in the midst of that. Not everyone has had an opportunity to see themselves in the midst of something that might be considered highly stressful. And it's interesting when you do get the opportunity to see and then take note of what your response was like in a situation. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this. It's really different for every person. Like you don't know what your autonomic response is going to be until you're in the midst of that situation. And then you start to get an inclination as to, okay, this is kind of how I'm built. And when you can start either planning or guarding against it, or you can sort of, I assume from your perspective, do exercises and things that you can do to sort of get that kind of thing under control.
Yeah, I really like where you're going with this, MK. So you've had that experience, so you know yourself in that way. And that carries with you wherever you go and whatever you do. So you'll feel certain things, and you probably say to yourself, oh yeah, I feel this happening right now. This is going on, my heart rate, my breath, the hairs on the back of my neck, whatever it might be for you. And then that's a cue. You can work with yourself. But for people who don't have that, who've never experienced that, or haven't brought it to their awareness, their conscious awareness, it's more difficult because it's an abstract concept still until you experience it. But if you can, for instance, in a tough conversation, if somebody who's listening to this can maybe take a moment and just check in with themselves and notice what's going on in the body. I like to reference the body a lot because it actually holds the key to our performance in a lot of respects. And it's one of the most immediate and direct ways we can get feedback about how we're doing in a conversation or in any kind of a stressful situation. And by, for instance, deliberately slowing my breath, I can actually immediately, very quickly start to change the shape of my autonomic nervous system and activate the relaxation response, and which is usually going the other side of this, the sympathetic side of the nervous system is usually what's triggered when we're under pressure and feeling anxious. And the other side, the parasympathetic side is the side that we want to activate there. And we can do that with relaxation exercises, deep breathing exercises, things like that. Also, we can say, hey, guys, folks, I just want to say that I'm feeling kind of anxious in this conversation right now. I may be the only one, but I may not be. And usually you're not. Usually, if one person's feeling it, other people are too. So that's a move that I really encourage my clients to start to make is these, I call them meta moves, where you go meta, you interrupt the flow and you take everybody's attention outside of the content of the conversation. So I'm doing this with you right now, MK. We're in this conversation and I just say, MK, let's hit pause for a second and look back in on how we're doing together in this conversation. Here's what I'm experiencing in myself. I'm interested in what you're experiencing. It seems on a certain level like a really simple, almost childish thing to do. And yet this kind of a move, this kind of meta move where you just stop the flow for a second, you hit pause and you reflect, I have found to be one of the most transformative moves you can make with groups. And as teams start to be able to do this with each other, you see conversations really start to shift. And it's not complicated, but it does take some discipline and practice together to do it.
Right. So one of the examples that that came to mind as you were explaining your version of this was I do a lot of public speaking. And prior to going on stage, there's a couple of things that I like to do in order to bring down my level of discomfort with the idea of getting up in front of a room full of people and talking. One of the things is I like to see the venue without, the entire audience there prior to the event. And then the other thing is like sort of getting a hold of that mental inner voice that can, and if you're not in check with it, speed things up when you talk, sort of just bring down this level of calmness, breathing exercises, all kinds of things and little tricks that I've learned over the years to help me with getting into those events, bringing down my level of angst and anxiety, and then being able to present and deliver in a way that I feel comfortable with. So I do liken that to, and I want to go back to this topic of the sort of the difficult conversations that leaders are required to have. And I found them to be some of the most challenging things that you can engage in just because folks don't want to be in that level of discomfort. Leaders, I don't know a leader that actually likes those uncomfortable conversations, and your ability to deliver them and to engage in them and to create that transparent and open setting that allows folks to have the kind of conversations you need for the purposes of growth can be challenging. Maybe if we can dig into that a little bit and talk a little bit about how you can prepare yourself for these difficult, I call, like you call them in the title of your book, this is the contact part, I think, of leadership. And this is an area that I think my audience can benefit from hearing from you.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you. Very few leaders enjoy those conversations. And when a leader does, I'm a little concerned. So,
yeah,
parent.
If you're conflict oriented and you love having those conversations, then there's probably some other issues that you probably need to be dealing with as a leader, other than that. But by all means.
Yeah. So along the lines of shifting contexts, what I really like to do and I find really helpful when I'm approaching a conversation or coaching a leader that is approaching a potentially difficult conversation is to have them connect with why it is they're having the conversation in the first place. In other words, to remember what is the purpose, what is the bigger picture within which this particular conversation is just a part. So for instance, if I'm having a conversation, a potentially difficult conversation with somebody who works for me, and then maybe it's a feedback conversation, everybody's favorite. One of the things that I'll do with myself first is I'll remember I'm actually doing this out of service. This is a contribution to this person, not because I am the omniscient one that knows exactly what they should or shouldn't be doing, just because I happen to be an observer and I'm in a role that allows me to observe them in a certain way and give them what I observe as feedback. And if I'm approaching it, in other words, if my internal story is, oh boy, I really don't want to do this. This is so awkward and uncomfortable. I'm afraid of this and that and how they may react. What if they cry? What if they storm out? Of course, all those things can happen. But if I have worked with myself, like what you described, you do with yourself before an important speech, then I'm going to be in much better shape because I'm going to be approaching it from the perspective that, hey, I really can be a contribution to this person's life. Yeah, it might be uncomfortable, but if I'm remembering that, then the things I say and the way I say things will more likely come across in that spirit of contribution rather than I'm tearing them down and I'm ruining their day and it's going to be a shit show.
Yeah, I mean, we have an expression here at Google, feedback is a gift, and that you should take it as such, an opportunity to grow and learn. You touched on something that I think super interesting. I'm wondering what your thoughts are around like sort of scripting. Scripting maybe not the right term, but mapping out the conversation. Do you think that's helpful?
Yeah,
for
sometimes
folks?
it can be. Yeah. It can be as long as you approach it as a work in progress and not as how the conversation will actually happen. It's an idea. It's like a
Right.
map,
Yeah.
but you don't
Yeah.
really know the territory. It's a predictive, hopeful map, perhaps. And if I remember that,
Yeah.
then I stay flexible and present and not locked into my script.
So you're a former CEO. I assume some of the experiences that you had leading, your own personal experiences, are part of probably the things that you've poured into the writing of a book. What was generally your experience like leading in practical terms? Like what did you take away from those experiences? Just a couple of high level things maybe that have stuck with you over the years.
Yeah, well, I was thrust into this position when I was pretty young. So I made virtually every mistake and then some that one can make as a leader. One of the big things that I learned that really fed right into my next career and to this book is I would have monthly staff meetings with we had 6 campuses around the Bay Area. It was a secondary school system, private school system, and each campus in a different community. And I'd get all the campus directors together and for a day-long leadership meeting. And some of those conversations went really beautifully well. And we would leave that day feeling energized and clear and connected. Other times it was as if, what did we just spend the last 8 hours doing together? And it took me a while to realize that it had something to do with me. In other words, I was looking everywhere else. I was analyzing all of my directors. I was thinking about
Right.
the environment, the agenda, this and that. And then it started dawning on me, wait a minute, maybe there's something that I'm doing or not doing that has something to do with how well these conversations go. And that kind of launched me after I left the school. That launched me in my career to becoming a mediator and facilitator and then a coach and a consultant. So it was really the lesson that I'm where the action is. I don't mean that in a narcissistic way, but in a kind of a very practical way, that I really have very little control over all of these other smart, creative, committed people, many of whom know much more about their area than I did. That was certainly true of my experience as a CEO. I was the least informed about what they were doing. But that's okay. It's okay for the leader to be not the expert in all these areas. It's probably preferable as long as the leader recognizes that they are a big factor in what happens with their people and their organization. And if they're having recurring problems and challenges, then it's an opportunity to look inside yourself. And I know Google has a program that's called Search Inside Yourself, actually. But that's where the action is. Yeah, we influence people all over the place, but if we're not doing it from a place of as much self-awareness as we can muster at the time, and we're all, of course, mostly blind, but even given that, if we recognize it, then we'll be a little less arrogant, a little less formulaic, and maybe a little more open to why does this person think this way? Or what might have that person behave that way in this meeting, as opposed to just instantly jumping into a story about how screwed up this person is or how selfish or how blind they are. If I first focus that lens on myself, I think I'm going to do a lot better.
So I just recently launched a formal coaching business, but I've informally been coaching others for decades. And I'm curious from your perspective, what do you think it is that brings those of us who intend to coach? What is it that brings us to that place where we believe we can help others achieve that next level of potential development and success? Like, what was it for you that guided you to the point where you said, hey, you know what, I think I want to start helping people in this regard, and then you go about doing
Well,
it?
I'm gonna venture a guess that the motivation for me is similar to you, but here's my experience. I never set out to be a coach. I didn't even think about it. I found myself while I was still CEO being asked by other leaders to come and work with their groups. And just from conversations we would have, it led to that. And I found, oh, wow, that's kind of interesting. I had no idea that I had anything to offer here, but people seem to be responding. And then I would be asked, well, can you spend a little bit of time here? I'm not sure that I really, understand what I'm trying to do here. And I just found myself, like you described yourself, you've been doing coaching for decades. I found myself coaching as well and realizing, that they seem to think I have something to offer, even if I didn't at first. And then B,
Right.
boy, it's really satisfying not having to have the answers and tell people what to do, but help them work with themselves and find the answers that really work for them. And that's how I see coaching. And so, I found myself doing it and I realized it's really satisfying. I seem to do okay at it. So then I, found myself, that's the work I'm doing. And it sounds kind of similar, I'm guessing, for you.
Yeah, no, I think that you certainly highlighted a piece for me that is absolutely the same, which is I spend probably an inordinate amount of time before launching this particular endeavor just being, people reach out to me. They're like, hey, I want to understand what you've been doing to be successful in the lanes that you've been successful in. Have a conversation with me, and I almost always say yes to those. Like I will spend 15 minutes, 20 minutes on the hook with someone, giving a little bit about my background, and then ultimately offering some kind of advice as to how they might take some steps, substantive steps in their own professional lives to develop themselves and move forward. And it struck me that, I didn't intend to be a coach, but I think there's a natural gravitation, especially when, at least on the outward appearance, people see that you've been, somewhat successful in some particular area. People tend to want to gravitate towards you and basically say, how did you do, or how did you accomplish what you were able to accomplish? And so that absolutely resonates. And you actually touched on another thing that I think is an interesting component of it. I absolutely feel that there's a little bit of the pressure has been removed. Like you touched on something that resonates with me from my background, which is I've made a lot of mistakes in leadership. I like to hope that I've learned from those mistakes. And so when I'm in a position to give someone advice, those the sticky part of those come back to me, and I'm able to relay those stories and with the level of confidence, like, hey, that particular way, given the circumstances that you just described, tends not to work. And let me tell you why. There's something to be said about that kind of experience that you're able to offer to others so that they can hopefully avoid making similar mistakes. So all of those things absolutely resonate. But coaching is a super interesting piece to me. It gets around to the point of, I think leadership can be taught. I'll be interested to hear what your thoughts are on that. That's an oversimplification of something that I absolutely believe at my core. But I always ask guests around what their thoughts are on the subject of, are leaders born or made? So let's go down that track in conversation. Like, obviously you're a coach. I assume you think some aspects of this can be taught, but where do you lay on the born or made?
Yeah, I'm absolutely very squarely on the made side. I do recognize that some people just seem to come out of the chute with a certain capacity for showing up as leaders and for being related to as leaders. And but that's not the majority of people. The majority of
Right.
people who find themselves leading had to work at it and cultivate that, and so it is learnable. And I see it's not just the actions or the things you say or the way you you show up kind of intellectually, but also the way you show up bodily. And this is where my Aikido practice really has played a big role in kind of recognizing how is somebody walk into a room. What's the feeling I have when I watch them sit down at the table or engage with other people? And that also can be learned. We can learn to cultivate our presence, just like we can learn to cultivate any other type of skill, just a different kind of practice.
Talk a little bit more about the presence thing, because coming from my military background, I've always thought that things like presence and bearing play a huge role on how people perceive you and how they sort of take you in. I have an expression that I tell people: know who you are before you enter the room, which is this idea that when you step into a room, depending on how you carry yourself or what people's thoughts are about who you are, things that sometimes are valid, other times are things that are just brought upon by impressions that you make on people. And I'm really interested in this idea of how you've tied your experience in Aikido to the subject of leadership. I always think that Eastern philosophy is an interesting tie-in to things like the practice of leadership and the discipline of leadership. So talk a little bit more about the presence, and maybe I call it bearing, but presence is an absolutely great word for it.
Yeah, well, I like what you said about know yourself before you walk in the room. So I'm going to riff on that for a second. The one way of thinking about that is we in Aikido, we really talk a lot about and work a lot on cultivating our center. And what that means is recognizing that we have a center of gravity. Just, generally it's a few fingers below the belly button. And that is a place in the body where all the major, most powerful muscles come together, sometimes referred to as the core. And it's an organizing place. When all of our movements are organized from and around our center, that's when we have power. Physically, when we try and just push or pull or move something with our arms or shoulders, that's the least power we have. If you watch good, boxers or martial artists or football players or anybody, any elite athletes, you see that their movements are very coordinated and they're never just using a body part. Tennis players, they have to engage their core, which is connected to their feet, connected to the ground. So they're unified. Our movements are harmonious. My hands are working with my feet. Everything is organized around my center. And that's when I'm unified, is when I'm at my most powerful. So your admonition to know yourself before you walk in the room, I listen to that as a kind of a version of what I'm talking about. If you
Right.
are really clear on what's important to you in this moment, what it is you want to accomplish in this conversation, in this room that you're about to walk into, and you've worked on yourself to be clear about that, then you're going to be more relaxed. You're going to be more grounded. Your movement is also likely going to be more fluid. And those are all, your breath is going to be easier. Those are all aspects of physical presence or bearing. How we move, how we walk, how we stand, sit, how we make eye contact, all of that has to do with presence. And it has a lot to do with not just our physical organization, but also our mental and emotional organization. If we're unified, if we really know what we're about here, we're going to have access to our power, and people are going to respond to it. Not like power, like forceful or aggressive. In fact, a different kind of power, a quieter power that people don't have to get defensive around or protect themselves from.
Right. So I've been threatening myself for years that I'm going to take up Aikido. I might have to pick up a different thread with you about that because have always been interested in the Eastern martial arts, but Aikido particularly is a super interesting one for me. So tell folks what they're going to get out of your book. What prompted you to write it, and what are the takeaways that you hope folks have in terms of diving in and reading it?
Well, I really wanted to write the book to bring together in one place the various threads that constitute my approach to coaching and working with leaders and collaboration. And those threads, the key threads, are one that we collaborate with our words, we lead with our words, but we don't realize that our words are actions. When we speak, we're not just conveying meaning or describing things, we're actually acting in the world. And there are very specific linguistic actions that I'm talking about when I say our words are actions. So I introduce that, and I go into detail about what those 5 linguistic actions are. I also talk about the role of our attention, that leaders and people, when we're collaborating, we can use our attention in a lot of different ways, but not all of those ways are always so helpful. We can learn how to use our attention, how to harness our attention so that it really can help us perform better, both as individuals, but also as members of a team or a collaborative group. And then there's the body. And we talked about that. There's the nervous system. How do we work with the nervous system? How do I cultivate a flexible, resilient nervous system so I can actually handle the kinds of conflict and pressures that come up in leadership all the time? And how can I do it and stay open and engaged? So I wanted to introduce and weave together those 3 elements. And I hope that people will, by reading the book, they'll recognize that even if you're working with a real jerk and the people around you seem like they're bad collaborators, there's still a lot you can do because it's not all about them. It has as much or more to do with you and how you're making sense of things, how you're using yourself, your words, your body, your attention, than just who else is in the room doing whatever they're doing. So I feel it's a real hopeful and pragmatic lesson, even though I draw on a lot of different theories that may seem a little bit less than pragmatic taken alone. So I'm hoping that I've painted a picture for readers that can really empower them to transform their leadership and collaborative performance.
I can tell you that some of the theories that you've espoused just in this short conversation certainly resonate with me as a longtime leadership practitioner, and I can't wait to dive in on the book. Where by the time that folks hear this, the book will likely already be available. Where can people find it?
It's now available just as of a few days ago on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, any online booksellers. And you can order the book. If your local bookseller doesn't have it, you can order it at any local bookseller, and you'll get it should get it within a few days.
Awesome. Full Contact Performance, The Internal Art of Organizational Collaboration by Grayson James. Excited about that, and I'm excited about this conversation here that I just had. I can't wait for people to hear it. So thanks for your time.
MK, thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Outstanding. So, folks, that's it for this episode of the Leadership Student Podcast. We'll see you next time. Be sure to like, download, share, and pass this on to others. Thanks for joining us.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Leadership Student Podcast with MK Palmore, part of the ITSP Magazine Podcast Network. If you learned something new and this conversation made you think, then add this show to your favorite podcast player, subscribe to the ITSP Magazine YouTube channel, and share the ITSP Magazine Podcast Network with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to connect your brand to our conversations and our audience, visit itspmagazine.com to learn how to sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey.